Our text today is read from the 4th chapter of the letter of St. Paul the Apostle to the church at Rome, chapter 4, beginning with verse 9. Cometh this blessedness then upon the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had being yet uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had, being yet uncircumcised. For the promise that he should be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. When we talk about Abraham and the promises made to him, there is a tendency to believe that this makes reference only to the nation of Israel and the things that pertain to them. It is believed that everything said about Abraham has fulfillment in the nation, either in the past or future events. The fact that Abraham was given the covenant of promise is often overlooked, misunderstood, or ignored. This covenant included the blessing of all nations of earth through faith. It was, in other words, the new covenant, or the New Testament of Christ and the church. It was given before the covenant of the law and the covenant for the nation. Now, this matter is discussed more fully in chapter 9 of Romans, and we will take it up again then. At this point, however, Abraham and the covenant that was made to him are brought into the discussion to clarify the issue as to whether or not the promise made to Abraham for righteousness through faith was to Abraham through the works of the law. In order to simplify the point, was it by the law to the nation or by faith to all nations? And to clarify it, the apostle says, we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? Was he in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. Now, if you recall, when the subject of circumcision was first raised in the letter of St. Paul to the church at Rome, we made a brief definition of circumcision and its meaning. I should say its meanings. Circumcision literally was a physical act which was performed on the body of male children to physically identify the religious separation of those children and that nation to God. But then, as the term continued in use, it was enlarged to include all of the ceremonies, rituals, and traditions. The tabernacle and its services were part of it, as were the feast days and all the other ordinances from God in order to identify their uniqueness. In the broadest sense, it means the nation of Israel in the era of the Old Testament, the circumcision. Circumcision had its beginning in the life of Abraham at the point when God commanded him to be physically circumcised. But that commandment to be circumcised envisioned the whole content of the physical covenant, the national covenant, the old covenant of the law, the covenant for the nation of Israel, all these terms which identify the same agreement. God had a temporary work which he wanted to accomplish through Israel. He called Abraham to faithfulness with respect to his involvement in that plan to bring about the Old Covenant reality. Abraham was a man of faith. He was in the habit of obeying God, so he was circumcised because God commanded him to be. But the significant aspect under consideration in the Romans text is that Abraham was declared righteous by God before he was circumcised. In this particular instance, as we talk about the circumcision, meaning the nation in the Old Testament, and the uncircumcision, meaning the New Testament and the spiritual people, we see that Abraham was justified by faith when he was still in uncircumcision. The religious meaning is that righteousness by faith was not the result of works done in and on behalf of the nation and the Old Covenant, and it was not reserved for that nation and its unique place in God's operation. But it was indeed for all nations of earth. By seeing that Abraham was declared righteous by faith before he was circumcised, we are taught that Abraham's works had nothing to do with his justification. It was by his faith and God's grace. We are also taught that righteousness by faith came before the national covenant. Therefore, circumcision and all that was implied by it, basically man's works, his moral character, and then in a little different sense, the nation of Israel and all of its prospects, came after Abraham's justification by faith. Justification by faith cannot be said, then, to be the result of the works of the law, nor was it in any sense limited to the nation of Israel. That is the teaching in this passage, and that is how and why these two terms are used, circumcision and uncircumcision. Now, in a certain sense, we are talking about three groups of people here. The people of other nations who were never circumcised, but who were justified by faith. The people of Israel who, though they underwent circumcision, were justified through faith in Jesus Christ. And those of the nation of Israel which underwent circumcision, who were part of the Old Covenant and part of that ritual and liturgy and tradition and physical thing that was the Old Covenant, but were never justified by faith. The Bible says that Abraham is the father of both the circumcision and the uncircumcision who believe by faith in Jesus Christ. Abraham becomes the spiritual father of both of these people, those within the nation of Israel who believed in Jesus Christ, and those outside the nation of Israel who believed in Jesus Christ. These things point directly to the covenant of promise. Now, in the book of Galatians chapter 3 and verse 8, it says that the Bible, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles or the heathen through faith, preached the gospel in Abraham, saying, "In you and your seed, which was Jesus Christ, shall all nations of the earth be blessed." Well, it is true that Abraham was also the physical father of the nation of Israel, and that would include those people who were part of the circumcision, but who did not have faith in Jesus Christ and who did not believe. Notwithstanding their unbelief, they were still natural seed, and Abraham was the physical father of that group, but he was not their spiritual father, because those people, by that account alone, had no spiritual standing with God. No one was ever born eternally into the family of God by being born into the nation of Israel. I know that there are confusions surrounding the covenants, the promises, the prospects, and the hopes of Israel, and I think that much of what we will say in the 9th, 10th, and 11th chapters of Romans will clear up some of those confusions. I don't want to preempt that discussion at this point, But let this be clearly understood. Please understand this. It's essential to the gospel truth. No one ever received any prospect of eternal inheritance from God by natural birth or by being circumcised under the law. Never did it happen. And all of those, according to St. John in the first chapter of his gospel, who are in the family of God are not born by the flesh, not by blood, not by the will of man, but of God. We find then that only those that are of the faith of Jesus Christ are part of Abraham's spiritual seed. Now, this will be a discussion which we will pursue in depth later. We see then that justification through faith is not only something that we do not earn by works, but also that it never had any unique application to the Old Covenant or to the nation of Israel. From the outset, it was offered to all men everywhere who would repent and come to God through faith in Jesus Christ. The promise that he would be heir of the world was not to Abraham or his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Do not forget that there was another covenant made with Abraham. Actually, it was not made with Abraham, but with Abram. Abram was Abraham's name before it was changed. It was a less exalted term. It meant the father of a nation, whereas Abraham means the father of many nations. Now, this is the covenant that was predicted in the 15th chapter of Genesis, but did not become a reality until much later in the wilderness of Sinai. That covenant was for a nation, not the nations or the whole Gentile world or all the peoples of the earth. Abram was not promised in the Old Covenant that he should be heir of the world or of all nations of earth. That was something that was reserved for the covenant of promise. In that covenant of promise, the inheritance was to come to Abraham or to his seed, not through the law, but through the faith of Jesus Christ. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise of none effect. One of the very real facts that we will talk about from time to time as we move along is the utter contrast between the proposition of justification by law as opposed to justification by faith. We're thinking now about the source, where righteousness comes from, how it derives, and how it becomes ours as a possession. And this is in stark contrast, and a conflict is here between the covenant of law and the covenant of faith. The two are not the same. In no sense are they the same. They do not approach the problem from the same avenue, and they cannot work compatibly together. It's a case of one or the other, because the one is a contrast to the other, and the one is in opposition to the other. If any man anywhere could have inherited the promise that God made to Abraham through the law, then this would have canceled out the covenant of faith and made it both meaningless and unnecessary. Well, that's what it says. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. The promise through faith was confirmed in Christ in the wilderness of Canaan 430 years before the law was given. But when the law came along, it became a dispensational reality before the dispensation of the covenant of faith. Now, you recall that in the 3rd chapter of this book of Romans, we talked about how God exercised forbearance with those ancients until the time that Christ would die, the new covenant would be established, and the faith of Jesus Christ would be declared. In all of those years, if anyone, by the law and its conditions, had achieved the blessing that God promised to Abraham, that would have invalidated the covenant of faith. Well, of course, it was never to be. And the promise given to Abraham was not through law. It was acknowledged by God at the outset that this promise could not be realized through the covenant of the law. St. Paul explains the conflict and the contrast and why the covenant of law is inadequate. Because, he said, the law worketh wrath, for where there is no law, there is no transgression. What is the practical effect that the law has upon Adam's children? I'm not talking about the character of the law itself. I'm talking about the law as a covenant and about what its practical effect is upon unregenerated people. The effect is to excite in them lawlessness, rebellion, anger, animosity, resentment, and to arouse in them a desire to do those evil things that are forbidden. That is what the law does to Adam's children. It piques their curiosity and excites their rebelliousness. The law does not make natural-born man good. The law actually brings out the worst in natural-born man, not because the law is bad, but because man is bad, and the law serves as a forum to bring that evil to the fore. Now, this may sound all very philosophical and lofty in tone, but we can reduce it to something that is very simple and practical. If you have something out in the garage, a mirror, a picture, an old heirloom, or the like, and you don't want the children to bother it, there's a moment of indecision in your mind. Do you tell them it's there and that they must leave it alone? Or do you realize that by telling them it's there, you'll only arouse their curiosity? So do you not tell them it's there and hope that they don't find it? And do you consider that to be a better way to protect it from the mischief of children? We know instinctively, even our own children, that the law works wrath. When we were young people in high school, we wanted to do something that was against the law of the school, the law of the land, the law of dress code, the moral law, any law. It wasn't any fun to do things that were according to the law. There was something in us that wanted to break the law, you see. This is the nature of the rebellion that is in Adam's children. You say, well, my children were never like that. Ah, my dear parent, how sadly out of touch you are, and how short your memory is. In the 3rd chapter of Romans, we talked about the nature of man as God sees it. St. Paul says that the law could not bring the promise of righteousness to man. All that the law could do was to draw out the latent potential for evil that was in every man and cause it to manifest itself. Where there is no law, he said, there is no transgression. That's in verse 15. Well, this has been a problem to some people, but it really should not be. It's a very simple concept. You need a law in order to have a transgression. A few years ago, there was no speed limit, no speed laws out in the Nevada desert and other deserts of the west and the southwest and prairies or high deserts. It just so happened that I was driving to Denver, Colorado, the very week that the national 55-mile-per-hour speed law went into effect. I was somewhere near Rock Springs, Wyoming, or maybe I was still in Utah. I don't know, along there somewhere. The exact moment that it went into effect, there were patrolmen sitting along the road. At high noon, they pulled out onto the national highway. It was Interstate 80 there, I believe. And from that time on, you could be a lawbreaker by the code which said, no man may exceed 55 miles per hour on this highway. An hour before that, A patrolman could not have pulled me over and charged me with breaking the law because it was not in effect. There was no code that said, "Thou shalt not exceed 55 miles per hour." There would not have been a transgression of the law. Now, that doesn't mean that I couldn't have been morally wrong, driving carelessly and faster than my vehicle was capable of traveling safely. It means that there was no code with which to charge me. There was no transgression of the law, even though there may have been a moral wrong. Well, this is the way it was with man before the giving of the law of God. Man was wrong in his heart. He did wrong things, but he could not specifically have been charged with the violation of any code because there was no code for him to violate. In the 5th chapter of Romans, we will get into a discussion about our evil nature on the one hand and the transgressing of God's law on the other. We will see that from Adam to Moses there were no transgressions because there were no laws. You cannot transgress a law unless you have a code, a statute on the books, a chapter, a verse of the law to cite. Now the law brought about wrath and guilt of having violated the code. But the one thing that it did not do was to bring man the promise of righteousness by faith. That was offered to Abraham through the covenant of promise. Therefore it is of faith, he said in verse 16, that it might be by grace, to the end that the promise might be sure to all seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of our father Abraham, who is the father of us all. It is by faith, that it might be by grace. Grace means free, unmerited favor. It is that operation of God wherein he has provided us that which we needed but could not earn, could not merit. It had to be by faith so that it could be by grace, in order that it might be available to everybody. There would be someone somewhere who could not meet the terms if there were any terms. I remember back in 1937, during the post-Depression years, when there was a milk war going on. The stores would give you the milk if you paid 2 cents deposit on the bottle, but back then there were a lot of people who didn't have the 2 cents for the deposit. Over in Pakistan, if you made the requirement a half a loaf of bread or a few crumbs or the meanest of things, there'd be somebody who couldn't have it because they could not come up with the price. When it comes to the gift of righteousness, nobody could have had it unless it were by faith, so that it might be by grace.